Hi, everyone, and welcome back. Trying to figure out what's really going on in the world right now, geopolitically speaking, it can feel, well, pretty overwhelming.
It definitely can. Lots of moving parts.
Exactly. So for this deep dive, we thought we'd try something a bit different. We're going to look at the current situation, but through the lens of history, specifically strategic thinking from World War II.
Right. Using past mistakes and maybe some successes to understand today, we've looked at some interesting analyses focusing on strategic errors and how they might play out now.
The core idea, really, is about flawed assumptions, isn't it? This idea that you expect your opponent to act rationally, or at least rationally according to your logic.
Absolutely. Military history is full of examples where one side just couldn't fathom what the other was doing because it didn't fit their own model of rational behavior.
Okay, so a big one you often hear about is Operation Barbarossa. Germany invading the Soviet Union in 1941.
A classic, yeah. And apparently, even some top German generals were, let's say, taken aback by the sheer audacity, the scale of it.
And the justification given was preempting a two-front war.
That was the line, yes. Attack the Soviets now to avoid fighting them, and Britain later.
Which sounds odd. Launching a massive new war to avoid another war, especially when Britain was still very much in the fight and undefeated.
And the Soviet Union at that specific moment wasn't really posing an immediate, direct military threat to Germany. It seems strategically counterintuitive.
It highlights that danger, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Building a strategy on a shaky foundation, and they hadn't dealt with Britain first.
No, the Western Front wasn't neutralized. Opening that huge Eastern Front while the West was still active? Well, history shows the consequences.
And Barbarossa itself, the plan, it wasn't exactly straightforward.
Not at all. That's a key point. It suffered from fundamental contradictions. There wasn't really one single clear strategic objective. It was kind of split.
Right. Multiple army groups heading in different directions, almost with conflicting priorities.
Exactly. Three diverging strategic goals, essentially. It worked maybe for that initial shock, the blitzkrieg phase, but for a long, drawn-out war, it wasn't built for that.
A war of attrition, which it became.
Precisely. And you saw signs of that very early on.
How early?
Well, think about this. General Holder, the Army Chief of Staff, he was already writing in his diary in July 41, just weeks in, expressing concerns that it was turning into a stalemate, a grinding fight. The initial speed was already gone.
Wow, that quickly. And wasn't there something about the forces assigned to Moscow, the main target?
Yes, that's baffling when you look back. Out of 14 armies deployed on the Eastern Front, only one was primarily aimed at taking Moscow.
Just one?
Just one army, yes. Now, they did concentrate most of their panzer groups, their tank formations, towards the center for Moscow, but even those had already taken serious hits in the initial battles.
And that brings up another point, logistics.
Logistics. The Achilles heel, you might say. They seem to have seriously underestimated the sheer wear and tear, the vast distances, the terrible roads, or lack thereof.
Not just fuel, but breakdowns.
Exactly. Critical parts failing, tank engines, for instance. They had a planned lifespan, based on operations in France. Russia was different, way harder on the machines.
So they needed replacements they didn't have.
In huge numbers. One report mentioned the 4th Panzer Group needing hundreds of replacement engines when the whole Army Group supply only had a fraction of that available. Their armored punch was weakening fast.
So the failure to capture Moscow wasn't just a tactical setback. It was strategic.
Absolutely. A massive strategic turning point. Suddenly, Germany is locked in this brutal, large-scale war with the Soviets still fighting Britain, and soon the U.S. jumps in. Major industrial powers.
It feels like the war was strategically lost right there, even if the fighting went on for years.
You could certainly argue that. Which leads to the next question. Your big strategic plan fails. What do you do?
And Germany's answer was the 1942 summer offensive towards Stalingrad.
That was it. Operation Blue, pushing south.
Which, again, looking back, seems questionable. After failing in the north and center, they go for this huge push deep into the south.
Very questionable. The stated aims were Stalingrad itself and the Caucasus oil fields. But let's say, hypothetically, they had taken Stalingrad. What then? What was the actual strategic game beyond just taking the city? There didn't seem to be a clear next step planned.
Just pushing deeper without a clear end game.
Pretty much. Driving into territory that arguably wasn't strategically decisive for the overall war at that point.
Yeah.
And the result? Well, we know Stalingrad.
A catastrophe.
The loss of the entire Sixth Army and others trapped too.
6 armies effectively wiped out. And from that point, you really can't see a coherent German strategy anymore. It all becomes tactical, reactive, trying to plug gaps, counterattack locally, no grand design left.
That distinction is crucial, isn't it? Strategy versus tactics. You mentioned Kursk and Brusilov as examples. Right. Kursk in 1943. That was a massive battle and ultimately a German defeat. But importantly, it had a strategic objective.
Which was?
To encircle a huge Soviet bulge in the front lines, destroy those armies, and maybe, just maybe, regain some strategic initiative, perhaps even open up paths towards Moscow again. It was ambitious, strategically aimed, even though it failed.
Okay, so it had a purpose beyond just fighting.
Exactly. Now contrast that with, say, the fighting around a place like Brusilov later in the war, or similar large tank battles after mid-1943.
More tanks involved maybe, but
often without that overarching strategic goal. By then, German actions were mostly about desperately trying to stabilize a crumbling front. Tactical maneuvers, yes. Large-scale battles, yes. But a unifying strategy driving them. Not really. From 43 onwards, arguably, Germany was operating without a real strategy.
it makes you think about this idea you sometimes hear about aimless strategies, especially in relation to, say, U.S. policy sometimes.
That's an interesting concept, and it's not entirely new. Well, back in the early 20th century, the famous chess theorist Siegbert Tarrasch, he strongly criticized playing chess without a clear plan, just reacting move by move. He basically said, you can play like that, but you probably won't win.
So an aimless strategy isn't necessarily having 0 goals.
Often it means the goals aren't clearly defined, or maybe not communicated, or perhaps there are too many competing goals, so there's no clear direction. It looks aimless.
Like maybe the goal isn't stated openly?
That could be part of it. Liddell Hart, the military historian analyzing World War II, he noticed something interesting about early German successes.
What was that?
He argued that sometimes Germany won when they presented multiple possible objectives. This forced the Allies to spread their resources thin, trying to cover everything. Meanwhile, the Germans could concentrate on their real, perhaps less obvious target.
Strategic deception in a way.
In a way. But Hart also noted that when the German objective became absolutely clear and singular, like Moscow or like Stalingrad, that's when their offensives tended to fail.
Because the enemy could then concentrate their forces.
Precisely. So the lesson seems to be operating without a clear, consistent strategy. It just leads to slow, messy, and usually unsuccessful outcomes.
Okay, so let's take all this historical context, these lessons about strategy, assumptions, logistics, and try to apply it to what's happening now, the conflict involving Russia, Ukraine, and the West.
It's a complex comparison, but there are potential parallels. One starting point is the perception of threat. Historically, Russia hasn't always been seen as a direct, existential military threat to core Western territories in the way Nazi Germany was.
But the perception of a threat has definitely been there.
Oh, absolutely. It's been a recurring theme in Western strategic thinking for a long time. And in 2022, it looked like some initial Western strategic goals involved perhaps regime change in Russia and definitely consolidating NATO allies all around Russia's borders, isolating it.
And we have to acknowledge the fighting is happening in Ukraine, but it really is in many ways a conflict between Russia and the West. Ukraine is the battlefield.
That's a fair assessment. And within the West, you see different priorities, right? The U.S. focus seems increasingly on China as the main long-term competitor.
Whereas Europe?
For some in Europe, Russia was historically viewed more through an economic lens, energy source, maybe even labor, although that's obviously shifted dramatically. And there were even some perhaps more ambitious ideas floating around about weakening Russia's nuclear arsenal or controlling it somehow.
So thinking about those WWII strategic mistakes, launching Barbarossa, for example, could initiating this current conflict be seen, from some viewpoints, as a similar strategic error, echoing those past invasions of Russia that ended badly?
It certainly raises that question. What was the alternative? Well, one narrative is that Russia felt increasingly cornered. Ukraine potentially joining NATO, maybe future Ukrainian military action in Donbass or Crimea.
So Russia's move was preemptive
Yeah.
to stop that scenario.
That's one interpretation. A preemptive move that resulted in a war that hasn't really gone according to anyone's initial script, or particularly maybe the Western one.
Then we saw Ukraine have success, didn't we? Counteroffensives near Izium, retaking Kherson.
They did. Significant tactical victories. But then came the crucial strategic question, okay, what next? Where do you realistically go from here?
And you drew a parallel there with Germany in 1942.
In a sense, the idea of using localized gains, tactical successes, to try and force a favorable overall peace settlement. Germany tried that in 42 leading up to Stalingrad, and it backfired spectacularly.
So is Ukraine now in a position maybe like Germany was in, say, summer 1943?
There are uncomfortable echoes, a situation where peace might be needed, but the conditions aren't right, or there's a reluctance to pursue it, especially perhaps from European partners who aren't feeling the direct, devastating impact of the war on their own soil in the same way.
And the dynamics seem to be shifting now, particularly with the U.S.
There are signs, yes, indications that the U.S. might be, shall we say, diverging slightly from the main European line on the conflict, whispers that maybe the U.S. proposed a more pragmatic peace deal earlier on, which Ukraine, possibly influenced by European allies, rejected.
Right, and the U.S. messaging now seems more focused on their own interests in Ukraine, commercial or otherwise, and dealing with Russia on those terms.
Potentially leaving Europe and Ukraine to manage the consequences of a longer war, which inevitably makes the prospects for a favorable peace for Ukraine look, well, dimmer.
Even Ukrainian officials are starting to sound more concerned publicly.
Yes, the realism seems to be setting in. It reminds me of an analogy an American diplomat apparently used, comparing Italy and Germany near the end of WWII.
How so?
Italy, despite everything, still functioned as a state. It had institutions. It could eventually arrange its own exit from the war, switch sides. Nazi Germany, on the other hand, had become something closer to a criminal enterprise, hollowed out institutionally. It couldn't orchestrate a similar negotiated withdrawal. It fought until total collapse.
And the suggestion is Ukraine might face a similar issue, that the leadership structure expected, perhaps, in an earlier peace plan scenario, maybe something linked to U.S. President Trump, might not be easily changed to facilitate a deal.
It's a possibility being discussed, that the mechanisms for a negotiated political transition might be complicated.
Which, if true, could mean
It might increase the likelihood of Russia feeling it needs to pursue a military solution, a large offensive, perhaps starting late April, early May, despite Ukraine's efforts to prepare defenses.
in the comparison to historical figures.
You
mentioned Manstein.
Just highlighting the perceived gap. The current leadership, whatever their strengths, are operating in a different league, strategically and operationally, than some of the renowned military minds of the past, like von Manstein, who Germany relied on heavily in 1943 to manage retreats and counterattacks. It's a different context, different capabilities.
So pulling it all together, the big takeaway seems to be about the danger of strategic mistakes, of not learning from history. It leads to long, costly conflicts.
Exactly. It really underlines how vital it is to look beyond the day-to-day tactical news and try to grasp the deeper strategic currents, the underlying goals and assumptions.
Which leaves us with a final thought for our listeners to chew on. Thinking about these historical parallels, what are the real long-term strategic goals of everyone involved in this current situation? And maybe the tougher question, are any of those goals actually achievable?
A critical question indeed. Something worth reflecting on as events continue to unfold.
Subscribe to our podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. We are here to make things clear. New episodes every day.